Imagine waking up one day and realizing that everything you thought was normal, everything you believed about the world and society, was carefully constructed to keep you in a state of fear, conformity, and obedience. Imagine discovering that what you thought was independent thinking was, in reality, a carefully orchestrated illusion, designed to make you part of a collective that no longer questions, no longer thinks critically, no longer sees reality for what it truly is. Today, we are going to explore one of the most disturbing phenomena in human history, mass psychosis. How entire societies throughout history have fallen into collective madness, losing their ability to think rationally and willingly, surrendering to delusions that lead to suffering, oppression, and destruction. But most importantly, we will uncover the hidden mechanisms behind this process, how it happens, why it happens, and, most crucially, how you can protect yourself from it. This discussion will take us through the insights of great thinkers, psychologists, and philosophers who have studied the fragility of the human mind when exposed to manipulation, fear, and mass hysteria. By the end of this video, you will have a profound understanding of how societies fall into mental illness and, more importantly, how to guard your mind against it. Let us begin. Throughout history, mass psychosis has manifested in different forms, from witch hunts and religious extremism to totalitarian regimes and ideological purges. But the core mechanism remains the same. Psychologists and historians have identified key patterns that explain how an entire population can be led into delusion and insanity without even realizing it. One of the most famous thinkers to analyze this phenomenon was Carl Jung, who warned that when individuals fail to cultivate independent thought and self-awareness, they become vulnerable to collective psychosis. A society suffering from mass psychosis is one where fear replaces reason, where independent thought is suppressed, and where blind obedience to authority becomes the norm. It begins with the erosion of critical thinking. People stop questioning narratives. They accept contradictions without resistance. They become so overwhelmed with propaganda that they lose the ability to distinguish truth from illusion. Think about moments in history when entire societies were led to commit atrocities under the belief that they were acting in the name of righteousness. The Inquisition, the Salem witch trials, the rise of oppressive regimes in the 20th century, all of these were fueled by the same psychological mechanism. Fear is instilled in the population, an enemy is created and dissenters are silenced. The people become trapped in an environment where questioning the dominant ideology is seen as dangerous, even immoral. How does this happen? How does an entire population surrender its ability to think critically and willingly, embrace collective delusion? It starts with the spread of fear. Philosopher Hannah Arendt, in her work on totalitarianism, observed that fear is the primary tool used to manipulate populations into submission. When people are bombarded with messages of danger, whether real or fabricated, they enter a psychological state where their rational faculties shut down. Instead of thinking for themselves, they look to authority figures to provide safety, even if it means surrendering their freedom. History has shown us time and again that societies undergoing mass psychosis reach a point where truth becomes irrelevant. Reality is no longer determined by logic or evidence, but by consensus. Whatever the collective believes to be true becomes the truth, no matter how absurd it may seem to an outsider. In his book, The Rape of the Mind, psychologist Joost Meerloo describes this as menticide, the systematic destruction of independent thought through psychological manipulation. But here is the most chilling part. People who fall into mass psychosis do not see themselves as insane. On the contrary, they believe they are the enlightened ones, that they are protecting society from evil, that those who resist are dangerous and must be silenced. This is why mass psychosis is so difficult to escape, because the ones trapped inside do not realize they are imprisoned. Now the question becomes, how can we resist? How can we protect ourselves from falling into the same traps that have ensnared so many throughout history? The answer lies in cultivating critical thinking, self-awareness, and the courage to stand alone in the face of collective delusion. But before we get to that, we need to understand the next crucial phase of mass psychosis, how it escalates, how it is maintained, and how those in power ensure that people remain trapped within it. Because if you think the process ends with fear and conformity, you are mistaken. There is another layer to this madness, a more insidious mechanism that ensures people remain prisoners of a false reality. And that is what we will explore next. Once mass psychosis has taken hold of a society, it does not remain static, it evolves. The fear that was initially used to destabilize the population must be maintained and reinforced. But fear alone is not enough. The next stage in the process is indoctrination, a systematic effort to ensure that the collective delusion becomes deeply embedded in the minds of the people. This is where propaganda becomes essential. In his book Propaganda, Edward Bernays, often called the father of public relations, explained how the minds of the masses can be shaped through carefully controlled narratives. He argued that public opinion is not formed spontaneously, but is engineered through repeated exposure to selected ideas, while alternative perspectives are systematically suppressed. Once fear has primed a society, propaganda ensures that the population continues to accept the illusion as reality. But there is an even more dangerous aspect of this process: the creation of a scapegoat. Every mass psychosis requires an enemy, a group that is blamed for the problems of society. In totalitarian regimes, this could be a political opposition, an ethnic group, or any faction that dares to challenge the dominant ideology. The purpose of this scapegoat is simple. It gives the masses a target for their fear and aggression. History has shown us how dangerous this can be. The witch hunts of the past were fueled by paranoia, leading innocent people to be burned at the stake based on mere suspicion. In more recent history, totalitarian regimes have used propaganda to turn entire populations against so-called enemies of the state, leading to purges, imprisonments, and even genocide. But here is where the process becomes even more insidious. As the population becomes increasingly immersed in the delusion, they begin to police each other. The fear of punishment for independent thinking does not always come from the government or those in power. It often comes from fellow citizens. Families turn against each other, friendships are destroyed, and people become willing participants in their own oppression. The psychologist Solomon Asch conducted a famous experiment that demonstrated just how powerful social pressure can be. In a simple test, where participants were asked to compare the lengths of lines, individuals were willing to give obviously incorrect answers just because they saw others doing the same. This reveals a terrifying truth about human nature. Most people would rather conform to the group, even when they know the group is wrong, than risk standing alone. And this is precisely why mass psychosis is so difficult to break. When a population reaches this stage, those who still see reality clearly find themselves in a dangerous position. They are seen as threats to the collective illusion. They are labeled as insane, dangerous, or even enemies of the people. The more they try to reveal the truth, the more resistance they face. This is why those who warn about mass psychosis are often ridiculed or silenced. So what happens next? Once a society has reached this level of delusion, is there any hope of recovery? The answer is both hopeful and unsettling. There is a way out, but it requires an immense effort, both individually and collectively. The first step is recognizing the mechanisms at play. Understanding that fear, propaganda, and social pressure are being used as tools of control allows individuals to begin detaching from the illusion. Philosopher Jiddu Krishnamurti once said, "It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society." This means that if you feel like something is wrong, if you feel like the world around you is losing its grip on reality, you are not the insane one. You are seeing clearly. But awareness alone is not enough. Breaking free from mass psychosis requires action. It requires the courage to think independently, to question narratives, and to resist the pressure to conform. It requires seeking out knowledge beyond what is fed to you, engaging in true critical thinking, and refusing to accept authority as the ultimate source of truth. Yet, as history has shown us, societies rarely break free from mass psychosis peacefully. The collective delusion must reach a breaking point, a moment when the contradictions become too great, when the suffering becomes unbearable, when enough individuals wake up to reality and refuse to participate in the lie. But here is the difficult part. Societies do not always wake up in time. Sometimes the delusion leads to collapse, destruction, and unimaginable suffering before clarity is restored. The question we must ask ourselves is, where are we now? Are we in the early stages of a mass psychosis, or are we already deep within it? And if so, What will it take for us to break free before it is too late? These are questions that every thinking individual must grapple with. And the most critical insight of all is still to come: how you as an individual can remain sane in an insane world, how you can resist the forces that seek to pull you into collective madness, and how you can play a role in awakening others before it is too late. Breaking free from mass psychosis is not just about recognizing its existence. It requires deliberate action to reclaim individual thought, restore critical reasoning, and resist the overwhelming pressure to conform. But here's the challenge. When an entire society is gripped by delusion, standing against the tide can feel like an impossible task. So how does one resist? How does one maintain sanity in an insane world? The first step is reclaiming your mind. The psychologist Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and author of Man's Search for Meaning, wrote that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. This means that even in the face of overwhelming propaganda, fear, and social pressure, you still have control over your own mind if you are willing to fight for it. To do this, you must break free from passive consumption. Every day, people are bombarded with messages designed to shape their perception of reality. From news outlets to social media, from entertainment to education, narratives are constructed and reinforced until they feel like undeniable truths. But the moment you step back and question these narratives, you begin to regain control. The philosopher René Descartes famously said, "To live without philosophizing is in truth the same as keeping the eyes closed without attempting to open them." The ability to think critically, to question, analyze, and challenge what is presented as truth is the foundation of mental independence. If you accept information without scrutiny, you allow others to shape your reality. But merely thinking for yourself is not enough. The next step is protecting yourself from the emotional manipulation that fuels mass psychosis. Fear is the most powerful tool used to control populations. When people are afraid, they become irrational. They seek safety above all else, even if it means surrendering their freedom, their reason, and their humanity. To resist, you must learn to recognize fear-based manipulation and refuse to be governed by it. The philosopher Epictetus, a leading figure in Stoic thought, taught that people are not disturbed by events, but by the views they take of those events. This means that no matter how much fear is pushed upon you, it only has power over you if you allow it. Emotional resilience, the ability to remain calm, rational, and grounded in reality, is one of the greatest defenses against mass psychosis. Yet, even as you reclaim your mind and build emotional resilience, there remains a deeper challenge: the pressure to conform. As we have seen, one of the most effective mechanisms of mass psychosis is the way society turns against those who refuse to participate in the collective delusion. People are labeled, ostracized, and even punished for daring to question the dominant narrative. This is where courage becomes essential. The Austrian psychiatrist Wilhelm Reich, in his book, The Mass Psychology of Fascism, explained that totalitarian systems thrive on the obedience of the masses. He argued that the most dangerous thing to a system of control is an individual who refuses to submit, because that individual threatens to awaken others. And this is where your role becomes crucial. Once you have freed your mind from the grips of mass psychosis, you have a responsibility, not just to yourself, but to others. The truth is contagious. Just as fear and delusion spread from person to person, so does independent thought. When one person dares to question, they create cracks in the illusion. And when enough people wake up, the entire system begins to collapse. But this is not an easy path. Standing against mass psychosis requires immense inner strength. It requires a willingness to be misunderstood, ridiculed, even rejected. It requires an unshakable commitment to truth, even when lies are more comfortable. And above all, it requires faith in the power of the human mind to break free from chains that have been placed upon it. The question now is, will you take that step? Will you have the courage to resist, to think for yourself, to refuse to be swept away by the tide of collective insanity? Because in the end, the fate of society is not decided by the masses. It is decided by individuals who dare to see clearly when everyone else is blind. And in the final part of this journey, we will uncover the most powerful truth of all: how mass psychosis ends, how societies awaken, and how the cycle of collective madness can be broken for good. Because as history has shown us, no delusion lasts forever. But whether we wake up before destruction or after, that is the real question. No delusion lasts forever. History has proven that mass psychosis, no matter how deeply entrenched, eventually collapses under the weight of its own contradictions. But the question is, does the awakening come before irreversible destruction, or only after society has been pushed to its breaking point? That depends on the courage of individuals who are willing to see reality for what it is, before it's too late. So how does mass psychosis end? What forces bring about the collapse of collective delusion? The answer lies in three key factors: the exposure of contradictions, the resilience of independent minds, and the inevitable return of reality. First, mass psychosis is inherently unstable because it is built on contradictions. When a society is gripped by delusion, it must constantly distort reality to maintain its narrative. But over time, these contradictions accumulate, and reality becomes impossible to ignore. The lies that once seemed convincing begin to unravel. The promises made by those in power fail to materialize. The fear that once controlled the population loses its potency. Historian Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who exposed the brutal realities of Soviet oppression in the Gulag archipelago, wrote, "The simple step of a courageous individual is not to take part in the lie." He understood that totalitarianism and mass psychosis cannot survive without widespread participation. The moment enough individuals stop believing the illusion begins to collapse. And this brings us to the second force that breaks mass psychosis: the resilience of independent minds. Even in the darkest periods of history, there have always been individuals who refuse to conform. They are ridiculed, persecuted, and cast out. But they persist. And their refusal to submit plants the seeds of awakening in others. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer famously said, "All truth passes through three stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as being self-evident." The journey out of mass psychosis follows this pattern. At first, those who question the dominant narrative are mocked. Then, as their voices grow louder, they are attacked. But eventually, as reality asserts itself, the truth becomes undeniable. This leads us to the final and most powerful force that ends mass psychosis: the return of reality. No matter how deeply a society is trapped in delusion, it cannot escape the consequences of ignoring reality. Economies collapse under the weight of unsustainable policies. Governments lose control as the people become disillusioned. The manufactured fears that once held the population in submission are revealed to be empty threats, and when the illusion can no longer be maintained, the system crumbles. But here's the most important part: while mass psychosis eventually ends, the nature of that ending depends on how long it is allowed to persist. The longer a society remains in delusion, the more devastating its collapse will be. If people awaken early, the transition can be peaceful, even transformative. But if the awakening comes too late, history has shown that the result is often chaos, suffering, and destruction. This is why the responsibility falls on those who see clearly. If you are among the few who can recognize mass psychosis while it is happening, you have a duty to resist, not just for yourself, but for the future of society. You must protect your mind, question narratives, and have the courage to speak the truth, even when the world is not ready to hear it. And perhaps most importantly, you must help others wake up, because the antidote to mass psychosis is not violence, nor force, nor coercion. It is awareness. The more people who break free from the illusion, the weaker the illusion becomes. It is a slow, often painful process, but it is the only way out. Carl Jung once warned, "The greatest danger to civilization is not the eruption of natural disasters, nor the collapse of economies, nor even the rise of tyranny. It is the unconsciousness of the masses. A society that refuses to think for itself, that blindly follows authority, that suppresses dissent in the name of conformity, that society is always on the edge of destruction." But the opposite is also true. A society that values critical thought, that cultivates independent minds, that refuses to be ruled by fear, that society is unbreakable. So the final question is this: will you be part of the awakening, or will you be swept away by the madness? Will you choose to see, or will you remain blind? Because mass psychosis only thrives when people choose ignorance over awareness. comfort over truth, submission over freedom. But once you open your eyes, once you truly see, you can never go back. And that is where true liberation begins. Thanks for looking.